Welcome to our continued teaching in the book of Daniel from Ner L'Reglai Jewish Ministries, teaching the Bible from a Jewish historical, cultural, and linguistic perspective. So today we will continue in the book of Daniel, looking at Daniel chapter 4, part 2, and I've titled this teaching The Testimony, because we're looking at the story of Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel chapter 4 is really just a recorded testimony of the king. As he himself states in Daniel 4:3, he said, "It has seemed good to me to declare the signs and wonders which the Most High God has done for me," right? So Daniel chapter 4 is a testimony. It's a story in King Nebuchadnezzar's life and how God intervened in his life in an amazing way. And we're focusing on that in today's teaching. Now, we began to look into Daniel chapter 4 last week and to understand the dream that King Nebuchadnezzar had. We call this his second dream because we have the first recorded dream in Daniel 2. I'm sure he had other dreams, but these are the ones that were meaningful, where God intervened in his life in a very personal and prophetic manner. And this second dream in Daniel 4 focuses on or the main theme of it, I would say, is the great tree. And we went over this last week, and we looked at the details of the dream as King Nebuchadnezzar delivered the dream to Daniel. I just want to review it just to understand the main points that we saw in the dream. So let's go through the dream one more time. There was a great tree that Nebuchadnezzar saw in his dream that was in the middle of the earth, and it reached to the sky, to the heavens. The tree was flourishing and it was green. It reached to the ends of the earth. It provided shade for the animals, a home for birds and its branches, and its fruit provided food for all flesh. There was something called a watcher, a holy one, who descended from heaven and commanded the tree to be cut down. The branches were to be cut off, leaving only the stump. All of the animals and birds were to be scattered, while the stump was to remain alone. And then an iron band was placed around the stump. And then we start to get into a personal personification of the tree, you would say. And it talks about how he was to be drenched, meaning the stump was to be drenched with the dew of heaven and live with the beasts of the field. And that his heart was to be changed from that of a human being to a heart or a mind of an animal for 7 periods of time. The decree was confirmed in the end again by the watchers and by the holy ones, and the purpose of the dream was explained. And then at the end, the king requested that Daniel interpret the dream for him, since his wise men were unable to interpret it, and because the king knew that the Spirit of God, or gods, lived in him. So that is a summary of what Nebuchadnezzar shared with Daniel. And I mentioned last week about this word Ra'anan, right? Because in Daniel 4:4, we read in the picture here, right? I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house and flourishing in my palace. And I pointed out that the word flourishing here is the Aramaic word Ra'anan, which means something green, something flourishing, like a green tree. And this is how King Nebuchadnezzar spoke of himself, and God spoke into that situation to show him this dream of this grand tree, right? But the tree was cut down. So God really, it's interesting how Nebuchadnezzar uses the same language that God spoke to him with. And I just want to further just explain something that I think is interesting or beneficial, and that's this Aramaic word Ra'anan is actually identical to the Hebrew word Ra'anan, which is used 20 times in the scriptures in the Old Testament. And each time that we see this word, the Hebrew word Ra'anan, in the scriptures, it's in the context of a green flourishing tree or the fruit of the tree, right? So it's very much in that context of something that is green and flourishing, particularly of a tree and its fruitfulness. And that's how Nebuchadnezzar is pictured in the dream, as something that was very flourishing and successful. So what was the purpose of this dream that Nebuchadnezzar saw. The watcher, this one who, the awakened one, as we saw last week, right? The one who alerted him, this watcher explained the purpose of the dream. I actually read this last week in verse 17, but we want to take a look at it again and look more at the detail. We did not talk about it last week. So let's read Daniel 4:17. This sentence is by the decree of the angelic watchers, and the decision is a command of the holy ones, in order that the living may know that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind, and he grants it to whomever he wishes and sets over it the lowliest of people. So this is the reason, the purpose of the dream. It's for all of the living to know that the Most High God is sovereign over mankind, and he sets kings and rulers on earth as he chooses. So I just want to point out here that this word, the living, this phrase, really, the living, right? The Aramaic word here is chayaya, and it's simply the plural of this word chai, which means a living one. And I'm pointing that out because it wasn't simply so that a living one, Nebuchadnezzar, would understand the purpose of the dream. It was for all living beings. So it's very clearly speaking of all life. It's all living beings. Nebuchadnezzar would learn a personal lesson from the events that transpired, but the message was for all of humanity. And this is probably why Nebuchadnezzar felt compelled to give his testimony in written form to all the peoples and nations of the world, right? That's what Daniel chapter 4 is. Daniel chapter 4 is a written testimony of King Nebuchadnezzar, of what God did in his life. And I really think that because this was a message for all living beings, Nebuchadnezzar felt compelled to write it down as well. One man received a dream and lived out the nightmare of these 7 periods of time, but its message was for the world. And that's an important aspect to this dream. Now, I want to just take a minute and compare Nebuchadnezzar's 2 dreams, right? There was the dream from Daniel chapter 2 and the dream of Daniel chapter 4. I just want to take a minute to compare them. So hopefully we all remember the dream from Daniel chapter 2, which is this image of these different metals, with the top image being, the top part of the image of gold being the kingdom of Babylon, right? All these different kingdoms. So I want to take and just compare this dream with the dream of Daniel 4. So the first dream of Daniel chapter 2, the image, it revealed God's global plan for the nations until the kingdom of God is established in this world. Nebuchadnezzar, or Babylon, the kingdom, were the head of gold, and that kingdom would be given to another nation, but no harm was prophesied to Nebuchadnezzar personally. Nothing actually was specified, was specifically demanded of King Nebuchadnezzar. So it was kind of a global vision that God gave to Nebuchadnezzar, but nothing was really demanded of him, and nothing specifically would happen to him except to acknowledge that he was the ruler of the world at that time. Now compare that to the second dream, right, that we're reading about here in Daniel 4, which is the dream of the tree. But the real message of the dream here is that we see how the Father heart of God is revealed to humanity, and to have a knowledge of salvation, which is illustrated through the life of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was this tree, the global power, similar to the first dream, but this time the tree, or Nebuchadnezzar himself, will be cut down and reduced to a stump, ready to be humbled. Nebuchadnezzar's heart would be changed to that of an animal, and he would live like an animal for a period of time. And Nebuchadnezzar had a specific responsibility. He had to repent and acknowledge that heaven rules and know that the Most High God alone sets up kings and kingdoms. So we want to continue looking at this second dream and see how Daniel responded to this dream, right? So last time we looked at how Nebuchadnezzar explained the dream to Daniel, and we continue today with the response and interpretation of the dream. So continuing in verse 19 of Daniel chapter 4, then Daniel, whose name is Belteshazzar, was appalled for a while as his thoughts alarmed him. The king responded and said, Belteshazzar, do not let the dream or its interpretation alarm you. Belteshazzar replied, my lord, if only the dream applied to those who hate you and its interpretation to your adversaries. So I'll pause for a second there and just kind of look at Daniel's response here, his dilemma. He was struggling to understand how to respond to the king. First of all, he was alarmed by the dream. Daniel did not need to pray for an interpretation of the dream. It was clear to him. He immediately understood what the dream meant, and it alarmed him. And he was hesitant to share it, right? He was hesitant to share this understanding of the dream to the king. And Daniel was personally grieved for the king and wished this dream only for the king's enemies. And then finally, the king encouraged Daniel to be honest, and then Daniel interpreted the dream. So this is very different from the dream back in Daniel 2, where Daniel and his friends were praying and God gave the revelation to Daniel through a dream. This was instantaneous. Daniel understood it, but struggled to share it with the king. So what is the interpretation of this second dream? So Daniel continues in verse 20. And he says to the king, the tree that you saw, which became large and grew strong, whose height reached to the sky and was visible to all the earth, and whose foliage was beautiful and its fruit abundant, and in which was food for all, under which the beasts of the field dwelt, and in whose branches the birds of the sky lodged. It is you, O king, for you have become great and grown strong, and your majesty has become great and reached to the sky, and your dominion to the end of the earth. So in the beginning of this, Daniel basically says, you are the tree, right? Your great majesty is being illustrated here through this grand tree that basically takes care of the whole world. The whole world is under its shade and under its provision and protection. So the tree represents Nebuchadnezzar. And then Daniel continued, and he said, in that the king saw an angelic watcher, a holy one, descending from heaven and saying, chop down the tree and destroy it, yet leave the stump with its roots in the ground, but with a band of iron and bronze around it in the new grass of the field, and let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him share with the beasts of the field until 7 periods of time pass over him. This is the interpretation, O king, and this is the decree of the Most High, which has come upon my Lord the king, that you be driven away from mankind, and your dwelling place be with the beasts of the field, and you be given grass to eat like cattle, and be drenched with the dew of heaven. And 7 periods of time will pass over you, until you recognize that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind, and bestows it on whomever he wishes. And in that it was commanded to leave the stump with the roots of the tree. Your kingdom will be assured to you after you recognize that it is heaven that rules. So what was the interpretation? In a nutshell, it is, you, O king, have been naughty, and God is going to discipline you, right? That's kind of a simple way to say it, but in essence, Daniel was saying, this is what it's saying. You have become arrogant, and God is going to discipline you. It is divine discipline. It is the decree of heaven upon Nebuchadnezzar's life. So a decree had been made in heaven regarding King Nebuchadnezzar. He would be driven away from mankind and live like an animal for 7 periods of time. The king needed to learn who the rightful ruler of the world is, the Most High God. It was discipline with a promise of restoration after the king recognized that the king of heaven rules, not the king of earth. And then we read this in verse 27. Therefore, O king, may my advice be pleasing to you. Break away now from your sins by doing righteousness, and from your iniquities by showing mercy to the poor, in case there may be a prolonging of your prosperity. So This was not part of the dream, but it was wise advice from one friend to another, from a loyal servant to his master. Daniel simply took the opportunity to say, I've given you the interpretation, but now take my advice. Turn from your sin and show mercy to the poor and to those who are less fortunate, and may you have a prolonging of your prosperity, right? Daniel was honest with the king. We have honest communication that is illustrated through this relationship with King Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel. Daniel confronted the sin of the king and counseled him to break free from his sin in righteousness, to show mercy to the lowly, to the poor. Daniel only desired good for the king while being honest and straightforward. As we know, the famous saying in English, honesty is the best policy. It's not always easy, but it is the best way forward to be honest, because you never have to look back and backtrack, right? And that's what we see applied here. But let's just take a minute and think about who we are and the friends we keep. What kind of friend are you? What kind of friends do you choose to spend time with? Do you have friends that will love you enough to tell you the truth? Are you willing to listen to others? Are you honest with your friends for their good and for their best, right? Do you have honest communication with your friends, with your family, with your community, whatever that may be? We read in Proverbs chapter 27, verse 6, faithful are the wounds of a friend, but the kisses of an enemy are deceitful. So the question, do you prefer wounds or kisses? Most people prefer the kisses from enemies rather than wounds from a friend. But we need to remember what the scriptures say. Faithful are the wounds of a friend, but those are going to be honest and tell us like it really is. But the kisses of an enemy are deceitful, right? The good things that we want to hear are not always the truth, and they can be deceptive. Honest communication. In the New Testament, we read this in the book of James, chapter 5, verses 19 to 20. My brethren, if any among you strays from the truth and one turns him back, let him know that he who turns a sinner from the error of his way will save his soul from death and will cover a multitude of sins. This is exactly what we see Daniel trying to do with King Nebuchadnezzar, right? He was simply giving him the truth and trying to turn him back, trying to take him from this life of sin and direct him to the God of heaven. And we need to remember that we have a great opportunity to be a blessing to others through honest communication and seeing others turn from ways that will be harmful, sinful, and save them from a multitude of sins. What happens if we are not honest with others? What is the result when we cease to speak openly to others? Right? There's a consequence. When we do not speak honestly to others, we generally talk about others, which we call gossip or slander. The truth always comes out. If we do not address others honestly, we will speak about them behind their backs. It's never a good thing. In Ephesians chapter 4, verses 25 and 26, we read this. Therefore, laying aside falsehood, lies, right? Speak truth, each one of you, with his neighbor. For we are members of one another. Be angry and yet do not sin. Do not let the sin go down on your anger. So we need to learn how to speak truth to one another, not falsehood. And we need to also realize, as it says in verse 26, it's not a sin to be angry, but we must be careful to not sin in our anger, right? It's a very fine line. Anger is a very kind of tricky emotion. But what we read here in Ephesians 4:26 is be angry and yet do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger. There's times when anger is appropriate, when there's injustices, when things are when someone is outrightly sinned against or is dealt with in a way that is totally against morality or against truth, right? And we should be angry when those situations happen. And we need to be able to learn to correctly respond to these unjust situations. So be angry, but do not sin. And we need to speak the truth. And this is a kind of a comical situation here of two neighbors, right? And basically with the longer nose showing the Pinocchio syndrome of when you lie, the nose grows longer, right? But we need to not be hypocritical and just say what others want to hear, right? But as it says in Ephesians 4:25, therefore putting away lying, let each one of you speak truth with his neighbor. We are members of one another. So speaking truth, balancing it with love and saying things for the best of the other person, right? Not selfishly just slandering others. And do not gossip. Gossip is an easy way to get things off our chest, as we say, to talk about things, but it's not to the right person, right? We all need to remember this rule, to not gossip. Yeshua spoke directly into this subject in Matthew chapter 18, starting in verse 15. He said, if your brother sins, go and show him his fault in private. If he listens to you, you have won your brother. But if he does not listen to you, take one or two more with you, so that by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, every fact may be confirmed. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the assembly. And if he refuses to listen even to the assembly, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Those who are considered to be outside, right, in that Jewish culture. But Yeshua gave us clear biblical instruction about how to communicate. Yeshua instructed us to talk honestly to others and to be proactive in dealing with issues of sin. Often we want the other person to take the first step. They need to do this, right? Yeshua taught us to take the first step when someone else sins. We need to act and speak for the good of our friend, of our neighbor, of our spouse, sibling, whoever it may be. Again, Ephesians 4:25, right? Be honest. We need to put away the lying, the falsehood. We need to speak truth, and we need to be unified. And it's easier said than done. Not an easy truth, but it is best for all when we do it. Again, Proverbs 27:6, faithful are the wounds of a friend, but the kisses of an enemy are deceitful. And like the prophet Daniel, what we see here in Daniel 4, we should strive to be a faithful friend, to communicate honestly with those in our community. We also saw that was in relationship, right? And King Nebuchadnezzar literally invited Daniel to speak. Now, getting back to the text that we were looking at here in Daniel 4, and we read about these 7 periods of time that King Nebuchadnezzar would have to go through before he acknowledged the God of heaven, right? Now, in Daniel 4, 16, 23, 25, and finally in verse 32, we read about these 7 periods of time that will pass over Nebuchadnezzar until he repents and recognizes the Most High as ruler over all mankind. So how should we best understand this concept of the 7 periods of time? What does this mean, the 7 periods of time? So this phrase, 7 periods of time, in Aramaic is Shiva Idanim. Now the word for 7 here is very clear, Shiva, but the phrase periods of time is mysterious. The Aramaic word for this phrase in the singular is Idan. And it can mean various time concepts, and it totally depends on the context. And as we've learned from past teachings, context is king, especially when we're talking about the Holy Scriptures, the Bible, written over 1,500 years in all different cultures and languages and time periods, and we have to put it in its right context. Now, this Aramaic word Idan is used 13 times in the book of Daniel in various ways. I want to just go through 3 examples just to show you the various ways that it's actually used in the biblical text. So example number 1 here is it's taken from Daniel chapter 2, and this is when Nebuchadnezzar had his first dream. It troubled him. He called in his wise men, and he asked them to tell him his dream and the interpretation. And they were kind of going back and forth and said, no one can really do this. And And then this is what the king said to his wise men. The king replied, I know for certain that you are bargaining for time, inasmuch as you have seen that the command from me is firm. So we see the word time here, and that's the word idan. And here it's used in a very general sense. So in that context, it could have been hours or days or even weeks that, maybe the wise men were trying to delay this. So it's kind of a shorter period of time, but it's time in general. It's a very general sense here. Example number 2 is taken from Daniel chapter 3. Now, this is when King Nebuchadnezzar had built this image of gold, right? And then there was all these rules about how they should bow down before this image. And we read here in Daniel 3:5, then the herald loudly proclaimed, to you the command is given, O peoples, nations, and men of every language, that at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. So here we see the phrase, the moment, and that word moment there is this word idan. And here we see that it is clearly something instantaneous. It's like a second or two, right? So this is another example of this word idan. And then in the third example here, going forward to Daniel chapter 7, and this is a prophecy about the Antichrist. In verse 25, it says, he will speak out against the Most High and wear down the saints of the Highest One, and he will intend to make alterations in times and in law, and they will be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. Now, this is a mysterious rendering of the word idan, and it's only made clear by other scriptures, and it's understood throughout the Bible, both Old and New Testament, as units of years, right? So it's a year, 2 years, and a half a year. So that's the 3 examples in their various contexts of how this word idan is used. So this phrase, 7 periods of time that Nebuchadnezzar would go through, could mean 7 seconds, 7 moments. It could mean 7 hours, days, weeks, months, or it could mean 7 years. It could mean any of these things, because this word is a very general word. So how does the context in Daniel 4 help to bring clarity to the 7 periods of time? And by the way, it could also be 7 seasons, right? And that's another possibility, and some actually think that's what it could mean. So what is the context in Daniel 4? Can we get any more clarification from what we read? So let's continue reading in verse 28. All this happened to Nebuchadnezzar the king. 12 months later, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. The king reflected and said, is this not Babylon the Great, which I myself have built as a royal residence by the might of my power and for the glory of my majesty? So we see how exactly 1 year from the date of the prophetic dream and its interpretation, it all came to pass. The dream came true. More like a nightmare in a sense. King Nebuchadnezzar was walking on the roof of his royal palace and began to boast of his great accomplishments of Babylon the Great, right? And I just want to point out here, just like King David, we see that kings often get into trouble when they walk around on the roof of their royal palaces. It seems like pride enters. They think about their vast kingdom and what they have built. And then they have their great fall. So we see that connection as we also saw last week with King David. So as we continue in the fulfillment of the dream, the realization of the dream, in verse 31, while the word was in the king's mouth, a voice came from heaven saying, King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is declared, sovereignty has been removed from you, and you will be driven away from mankind, and your dwelling place will be with the beasts of the field. You will be given grass to eat like cattle, and 7 periods of time will pass over you until you recognize that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind and bestows it on whomever he wishes. Immediately, the word concerning Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled, and he was driven away from mankind and began eating grass like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair had grown like eagle's feathers and his nails like birds' claws. The word of God was fulfilled for Nebuchadnezzar exactly how it was revealed to him, and interpreted by Daniel. He was driven away from mankind and made to live like an animal. He ate grass like a cattle. His hair grew as feathers like an eagle, and his nails grew like claws of a bird. So what did this look like? There's lots of images that you can check out that people have tried to personify this time when King Nebuchadnezzar was driven away from mankind. You see the kind of the city of Babylon in the background of this picture with the man walking through the forest, the swamp, like an animal. And then here we see the king ate grass like cattle. Not a pretty picture, obviously, of a person acting like an animal. And this is a more kind of funny or humanizing picture of the king trying to find grass to eat as he's finding his way through the barren lands here. So there's, it's hard to imagine what this would have been like in reality and who would have saw him at this time. Now, how long did the king live like an animal? Now, it could have been 7 weeks, 7 months, 7 years, or some other understanding of 7 periods of time. Like I said, 7 seasons, maybe 3.5 years. Unfortunately, there are few clues in the text to make an exact determination. But because of the process of becoming like an animal, growing the hair and the claws and everything, it was most likely a period of at least 7 months, up to 7 years. Could have been, 2 years, it could have been 3.5 years, some type of counting of 7 periods of time. So what really happened to Nebuchadnezzar during that time outside of what we read here? We only really have the biblical account. It's mostly detailed for us there in Daniel 4. But Daniel does provide another perspective of this account decades later, right? It was 30 or 40 years later at the end of the Babylonian Empire when Daniel was called before King Belshazzar. And Daniel actually gives a retelling of what happened to King Nebuchadnezzar. So we read these details in Daniel chapter 5, right? This is Daniel reflecting back and trying to teach Belshazzar a lesson here about what King Nebuchadnezzar had learned, right? And this is Daniel speaking. He says, because of the grandeur which he bestowed, meaning God bestowed on Nebuchadnezzar, on him, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language feared and trembled before him. Whomever he wished, he killed, and whomever he wished, he spared alive, and whomever he wished, he elevated, and whomever he wished, he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit became so proud that he behaved arrogantly, he was deposed from his royal throne, and his glory was taken away from him. He was also driven away from mankind, and his heart was made like that of beasts, and his dwelling place was with the wild donkeys. He was given grass to eat like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until he recognized that the Most High God is ruler over the realm of mankind, and that he sets over it whomever he wishes. So we see a lot of similar detail here in Daniel 5. We know that he acted like an animal, dwelt with the animals, and lived like an animal. Daniel adds a little bit about with the wild donkeys, right? It was because of his arrogance, the king's arrogance and pride, that God humbled Nebuchadnezzar until he changed his mind and acknowledged the Most High God. The king had every worldly reason to be proud of his success, but he had neglected to acknowledge the God of heaven. Now, as we understand the testimony of the king, we haven't quite gotten to the end yet, but we realize that this had to be the most humiliating experience in the life of Nebuchadnezzar. Most people try to cover up these types of embarrassing life experiences, especially something like this of acting like an animal. King Nebuchadnezzar made sure that the whole world knew of this experience by writing out his testimony. And we are still talking about it today. And I think that there is a humility in doing that. But I think there is power in the testimony, right? Testimonies are powerful. And I think just as Nebuchadnezzar experienced the power of God in his life by giving him this dream, showing him what would happen a year ahead of time, experiencing this for 7 periods of time, and then being able to be restored and recognizing it was only the power of God, right? Nebuchadnezzar knew he had to share it. And that's why I think it's so valuable to review this testimony of Nebuchadnezzar. Just like Nebuchadnezzar is sharing his story, we each have a story to tell, right? So what is your story? What is the God story in your life to share? We all have hopefully an encounter with God, and maybe several along the journey of how God works in our life. What is that story that we can all share? I want just to end with a verse in the book of Revelation, chapter 19. And this is when the Apostle John had been given all these different revelations and visions and that he recorded for us in the book of Revelation. Towards the end here, we see him having a conversation with an angel. And it says this in Revelation 19. The Apostle John says, "Then I fell at his feet to worship him. But he said to me, 'Do not do that. I am a fellow servant of yours and your brethren who hold the testimony of Yeshua. Worship God. For the testimony of Yeshua is the spirit of prophecy.'" Revelation 19:10. Now, if you believe in and hold to the testimony of Yeshua, you have a story to tell. It's really about Yeshua. It's about the power of God in our lives. And that is the real testimony, right? But what does this phrase mean? For the testimony of Yeshua is the spirit of prophecy. When we declare the testimony of Yeshua, we are testifying to the one who was and who is to come. He is the living God, right, who interacts in our lives. Yeshua is God's prophetic word, and we have the privilege of releasing the spirit of prophecy when we share our stories about how Yeshua has changed us, about how God has worked in us and done an amazing work, just like Nebuchadnezzar did, right? He's simply sharing what God did in his life and how he was changed through it. So, what is your testimony? We each have a testimony to share, and the more we are able to share it, we are allowing the spirit of prophecy to enter this world and allow others to be affected, to understand there is a living God and he works and moves. And just like we're talking about the story of Nebuchadnezzar today, right? God is still working, and we each have a story to tell, a testimony to share. So share your testimony. So that's the conclusion of Daniel chapter 4, part 2, the testimony really of how God worked in Nebuchadnezzar's life. We want to continue with the last part of Daniel chapter 4 in our next teaching. So in preparation for our next time, please read Daniel chapter 4 again, and we will bring the Daniel chapter 4 to a conclusion next time. So again, we want to thank you for watching our teaching series. If you are benefiting from these series, we want to invite you to give a donation of any amount to support this ongoing Bible teaching ministry. And you can partner with us today by clicking the Give tab and give any way you choose. Thank you so much, and see you again next time.